Well, maybe we will get started then. I guess I'll have to introduce myself too, but Tori, do you have any announcements or anything you want to say before we get started? Tori's our co-organizer.
So, no, I don't have any announcements here, but I'm looking forward to also the next presentation, which will be Sean Corfield in December. So, just probably one to put on the calendar. And I give a little introduction. I don't know Jacob too well, but he has some really cool projects. He's actually the one who introduced me to this group. So, Jacob, are you a contractor or are you totally self-employed right now?
Self-employed would be the euphemism for it, yes.
Okay. And he has some, so he's got several major projects. I'm excited to hear what he's got to tell us tonight about one that he's been working on for a while that I've seen him publicizing on see, I don't remember if you showed up on Hacker News, but I know I've seen you on both Reddit and Twitter. So I'm excited to hear about the engine behind Biff. So
All right, thanks.
that's it.
All right, and since I think we had at least one person who just showed up. So let me just give my last explanation one last time. Sorry, you've all heard it again. But so originally our presentation was going to be given by Dan Bell. He's not able to make it tonight, presumably. So I will be stepping in anyway. And with that, let us jump into it. Um, and if I fumble with the presentation, now you know why. So you can't blame me. All right, let's see. Need to move this over here. Okie dokie. So, okay, let me move this thing. All right, so Biff is a project which I have been working on for quite a while. It is a self-hosted Firebase alternative for Clojure. Um, and what does that even mean? So especially if you're not familiar with Firebase, basically Biff is two things. So it's a web framework, like Django or Rails or whatever, or Phoenix. Um, and so it includes all the parts that you need to make a fully functional web application out of the box, but it takes all those parts and it pre-assembles them for you. But then on top of that, on top of that, Biff also includes deployment in its scope. So it tries to make deployment as easy as possible, but it's a little bit different because there's been a lot of work that goes into trying to make deployment very easy to do for various people, and a lot of it tends to be in sort of platforms like Heroku or Firebase, right, where they make a platform and you deploy to that platform, and so since they control the whole thing, they can make it very smooth. Biff is meant to be not tied to any particular platform. It's just self-hosted. And so it integrates tightly with Terraform. So Biff comes with configuration out of the box for DigitalOcean, since that's what I use, but you could pretty easily have it deployed to AWS or any other cloud provider with just a little tweaking. So yeah, the main vision, though, is that ideally with Biff, if you have some idea for a web application that you want to create, and even if you're not very versed in Clojure yet, if you're still kind of getting up to speed with Clojure, Biff should make it so you can take that idea and go to the MVP stage as quickly as possible without having to focus on setup. You should be able to just focus on your idea and iterating. But with that, we also want to do it without sacrificing the things that make Clojure very good in the first place, like the emphasis on simplicity. Because we want to make it so, even after you get to that initial MVP stage, you can keep going and you can keep growing your application, and Biff should never get in the way, which is kind of the hard part about frameworks. They often make it easy at first. The hard part is keeping it easy as you go. So we'll get a little bit more into that. a little bit of background. So I have been doing my own thing for about 2 years now, and that has involved working on a lot of early stage web applications and doing a lot of pivots too. And so the benefit of that is I've had lots of opportunities to, experiment with different things. And, every time I start a new project, I can say, okay, well, this thing I tried turned out pretty good. I like that. Let's do that again. But this other thing turned out to be more trouble than it was worth. So I've done a lot of experimentation. And eventually, let's see, it was early 2020, I kind of ended up on Firebase. And I like Firebase quite a lot, actually. It makes things very easy. I was able to, focus on my application, but it still was kind of limiting. There were things I ran into that I just, once again, this kind of cycle, it just kept repeating. Every time I tried a new project, I would hit some point where I'm fighting against whatever framework or platform I was working in. And so I did start kind of running into the same thing with Firebase. However, by that time, I'd also kind of developed a pretty good idea of what I wanted to get out of a web framework and just my whole deployment solution too. So I decided to move away from Firebase, move away from platforms and things, and kind of just go from the ground up. So do my own deployment on just regular virtual machines and sort of code my own framework from scratch. And so that became BIF. So BIF is primarily just a way for me to reuse the code that I've already written as I've worked on my projects. So from here, we'll get into what exactly does BIF look like and how can you use it. But does anyone have any questions?
Like, I guess digital, like your choice of like platform that you did have to go to, like I'm curious why a little bit, and then maybe like in terms of moving it around and evolving it, um, like what's sort of, I guess it's like this is a really big question, but like since that's a goal, how do you see that working out? Like in terms of what have you done to make that possible? Like what's your reasoning why that's possible here? Because it's definitely like a pain point. If you have like some idea that you want to, maybe I want to do something different with the front end. Frameworks are usually it's like hard to kind of change the way they're managing state, for instance.
Yeah.
So I'd be curious how we're addressing that, because that's a really interesting problem.
Yeah. And so for the second point, it sounds like you don't mean necessarily like specifically about DigitalOcean per se, but are you saying just like in general, how do you make sure the framework makes it so you can keep changing things around?
Yeah, because I mean, like you said, and Rich Hickey has said too, it's like the easier you make it, the more potentially you're kind of locked into something. You've made it like rigid. That's what's made it easy. So I feel like that in particular is a tall order. But I mean, I think I would be personally happy with just within the Clojure ecosystem being able to maybe exchange, you know, different concepts as you needed them. Because there's certainly like problems that like the pros and cons, you know, like maybe it's okay if your application's really slow at the start. You don't need, you know, full client server side like minimal diffing in order to succeed. But like you don't want to, yeah. I'll so that's I'm interested how like those things can be shipped in and out and exchanged as you like want to evolve things.
Yeah, definitely. I will punt on that question for a little bit because the whole second half of the presentation is aimed on answering exactly that. So it is a great question, and I will get to it soon. I wouldn't say that I have like the answer or anything, and I don't know if there even really is like an answer, because it's just an inherently difficult problem, like you mentioned. But I think BIF hopefully has some good ideas that can make the situation better. We'll see. Anyway, so yeah, we'll get to that. Anyway, let's see. Let's move on for this next section. So getting started. So for making a new app with BIF, I have set up this little sort of install wizard thingy. And this is in the documentation. And so you can just copy this command into your terminal, and then it will run a little wizard thing that'll ask you a few questions and then set up a project template. So, I mean, you're probably familiar with these kinds of things, right? And so the main question that you need to answer for a new BIF project is what kind of project type you want. So BIF comes with two. You can have a single page application, which is kind of the full BIF experience, right? Includes React and Clojure-Script and some other things. However, not every application needs to be a single page application. And so there is also a template for just more traditional, like server-side rendered applications. And that's actually what I'm using for my startup at the moment. Although previously I was using the single page app stuff. So let's see, let's move on. Okay, yeah, so then once you have set up your project, it will print out some instructions for how you can, start this development app that you've now made. And once you load that app, this is what it will look like, at least for the single page application template. And so this is a simple CRUD app, and it includes pretty much all the main features of BIF. So it's a good demonstration of, how does it work and how can you use it. But it also is not too complex. So it's a good starting point for you to be able to just change things and turn it into your own application. But let's go through the parts here, and I'll just talk about the features of BIF and what it does for you. So first of all, kind of standard, we've got authentication. So you can log in and you can log out. And then down here, we have some demonstration of reading and writing data. So for this box, for example, if you type stuff into this box and then you hit update, it will set the foo attribute on a certain document to the text that you have typed in. But it will do this in a somewhat fancy way. And so BIF includes a feature kind of like Firebase. So both Firebase and BIF let you submit transactions and queries directly from the front end to the database. So you don't have to set up a custom endpoint. I often think about this when I think about my previous job. And if you were to trace in the code, so you have an SQL database, and if you were to trace like, okay, this piece of data in this column, where are all the places in the code base that it has to go to before it gets to the front end? And it goes all over the place, right? You've got like a record class and then a model class and then serialize it and deserialize it, blah, blah, blah. So that's a very nice thing that Firebase and BIF have done, is it kind of bypasses all that and makes it feel kind of like you have direct access to the database on the front end. And the way it does this is by using an authorization rules setup. So you can define rules on the back end which define who has access to what kinds of data. So you do still have to define something on the back end, but once you set those up, then when the front end submits a transaction, for example, BIF will check that transaction against the rules you have defined and figure out, is this transaction allowed or not? And if it is not allowed, then it will be rejected. So that's the way that this update thingy will work. And that works pretty well for basic writes, like you might find in just CRUD applications, like if you have a bunch of settings for the current user or something and you just need to add more text fields or whatever, it works very well for those kinds of things. In other cases where you have more complex writes, it's probably not really that much of an advantage, because if like the logic of the write you're doing is fairly complex, then the overhead of just adding a custom endpoint to handle it won't really matter that much. For example, if you are making a board game, board games tend to have lots of complex logic and state transitions. Like you can, certain users can do certain kinds of writes, but only in certain kinds of situations. And then once you do that, the state changes to some other thing. And so those kinds of things, it's usually better to just do it kind of the traditional way, just set up an event handler. And that is what the second box here does. It's pretty much the same thing as foo. It'll set this bar attribute to something. However, instead of going through, Biff's fancy transaction thing, it just goes through a custom WebSocket event handler. So you can look through the code in the demo app and find out, how do the two ways work, and et cetera, et cetera. Any questions so far? Cool. Well, let's continue next bit. So the last part in this little application, this kind of showcases one of Biff's big cool features. It's so writing messages. Biff, like Firebase, also provides subscribable queries. So you can write a query that says, fetch me all the documents that meet these criteria. And Biff will send them to you, but then also if any changes in those documents happen on the back end, Biff will notify you about the changes. So kind of the classic example is a chat room, right? So if you enter a chat room, you want to get notified of any new messages that have been put in that chat room. And so that's what's happening here. So if here we've got two separate users who have both logged into the demo Biff app. And you can type a message and hit send. And then when you do that, both users will see the message right away. And so it's kind of like if you're familiar with the Web After Tomorrow, written by Tonsky. This is kind of like that thing, in the sense that like you're able to have a slice of your database that is synced transparently to the front end, and it's always up to date, and all the coordination is handled for you by the framework. You don't have to worry about it. The main downside is that the query power you have when doing these subscriptions is somewhat limited. So for example, you cannot do a query that says something like, let me back up. So say you're making a Twitter clone. You cannot write a query that says, get me all of the users I follow, and then also get me all the messages that they have sent in the past 10 minutes, right? You could do something like that with SQL or Datalog, but with Biff subscribable queries and with Firebase.
And to get the Lieutenant Governor of Michigan, who was just with me, back on this, but there is reporting coming out of Detroit right now that the Wayne County Board of Canvassers' decision to certify the election has been made, that they have, in fact, the 4 members of the Wayne County Board of Canvassers has decided to vote unanimously to certify the results in Wayne County, which is where Detroit is. It is the most popular.
Okay. Well, that was exciting. I'm sure whatever it was talking about was exciting too. So let's see, where were we? So we were talking, yes, so so queries. You cannot do that kind of query with SQL or Datalog. So with Biff or Firebase, if you were to want to do some kind of complex query like that, you would have to break it up into at least 2 queries. So you could do one query at first that says, fetch me all of the users I follow. And then you have to wait for a network hop. You have to wait to get the results of that query. And then once you have the results, you could submit another query that will, take the list of users you follow and say, get me all the messages that these people have sent in the past 10 minutes. So in other words, you can do filtering, but you cannot do joins. So it's a little bit of a restriction, and I was always kind of amused when I would read the documentation on Firebase, because they describe these queries and they say they're extremely powerful queries and very expressive, blah, blah, blah. And I would think, maybe if you've never used SQL before, but I don't know. But despite that, they are still quite useful, actually. And And it turns out you can go pretty far with them, basically because it's not horrible to just coordinate joins on the front end, kind of like I was mentioning. And BIF has some things for you out of the box that will help you, set queries like that up. So if you want to do a complex query, you can define it as multiple queries, and BIF will help you sort of coordinate those joins and stuff. There are some downsides because now you've got, a network hop in between each query and blah, blah, blah. But for a lot of cases, it's kind of good enough. Anyway, so the big epiphany I had that actually led me to making BIF in the first place is that I realized that because of that restriction, it means that implementing these kinds of queries is actually not very hard. Because if you followed the space also, like again, going back to Web After Tomorrow, you may be aware that the problem of if you were to take, an SQL query or a data log query and take some, database changes and find out, has this query been affected? That is an extremely hard problem. It is a research problem. And people are working on it, but it's hard, right? However, if you add the restriction of no joins, it becomes an extremely easy problem because all you have to do is so I'm using Crux for the database, right? So Crux is a document database and it gives you a transaction log. So all you have to do is you watch the transaction log, and the log consists of a list of documents. So whenever there's a change, and so you take each document one at a time, and you take the document and you look at the version of the document before the transaction and after the transaction. And then you go through a list of queries that clients have subscribed to. And you take the two documents and you say, was this document a part of the query before the transaction? And was it a part of the query after the transaction? And if the answer to any of those questions is yes, then you notify the client about the change. And the key is because of the restriction of no joins on the queries, when you are checking to see is this document a part of this query, it's efficient. It's a constant time operation because the only thing you ever have to look at is the current document because it's not joined to any other documents. As opposed to like if you were trying to do it for SQL or data log queries, if to know if this query is part of the document, like if you're doing it the naive way, you'd have to just run the whole query again, which is not a constant time operation, right? Anyway, so once I kind of had this idea and I realized like, whoa, you could build this and it wouldn't even be that hard. I felt like I've got to build it now, right? And so I took like, I think a weekend. I sort of bit off more than I could chew because I thought, oh, the idea is so simple, right? Like I just explained to you the whole thing. Turns out when you actually implement it, there are a lot of little details that you have to take care of. And so it's a little bit complex, but not horrible. And, it's here, it's done, and now we have BIF, voila. So I was very happy about that. That is pretty much all of the demo app. So those are the main features of BIF and what it gives you. And the last little bits that I want to cover. So here, this is a little screenshot of BIF's documentation. So I have put many hours into writing comprehensive reference documentation for BIF. In addition to, there's some in-code documentation that in the demo app that kind of guides you along. So if you are learning BIF, you can kind of go back and forth between, just experimenting with it, playing around and reading the code that it gives you, but then also switch back and forth between that and, doing a deeper dive into the reference documentation to get a deeper understanding of how things are working. And then once you have all of that taken care of, the last bit is deployment. So I have a section here that's totally dedicated to deployment. Excuse me. And so the first time you deploy, you have to follow a handful of steps to get things set up. Like, if you don't have a DigitalOcean account, you have to set one up. And you have to set a handful of configuration values and some other things. But once you have all of that taken care of the first time, deploying is a two-step process. So you deploy to Git. Sorry, not deploy. You push to Git, put your code on Git, and then run this shell script command, which Biff defines for you. And this will take your code from Git and put it on the server and start the application for you. And it takes about 30 to 60 seconds. And then your application is live. Woohoo. And this can all be done on a $5 a month DigitalOcean droplet also, which is nice for experimenting. If you are doing something more serious, then you probably want to pay a little bit extra, at least to get, a managed Postgres instance for persistence, which is what I do with my startup. But you can run an app on $5 a month, which is nice. And let's see. So, sorry, let me scroll through my notes a little bit and make sure I didn't miss anything important. Okay, so yes, so that is pretty much Biff, and now you're all experts on it. So this is sort of the second part of the presentation that I mentioned before, where we talk about, how do we keep it simple? Before we dive into this, any questions or comments from anyone?
Is there like a potential stage before you're optimizing for like the no join query that Biff is using? Like if like how slow is it if you just rerun the transaction every time? Because it seems like why is that should that be an option, for instance, like, and then when you graduate you have to make it slower because you can't do that anymore, or that's from like a evolution perspective, with you hit that so soon that it's like irrelevant?
Yeah, I haven't run any like benchmarks or tested or anything.
I just mean in your personal experience, like what did you, when you ran into it, like, because I know that, yeah, the part you're talking about, like it's a research problem, like is it like, could you like elaborate on that just like a little bit? The issue is that like you can't figure out if it's joined, then there's no way, it's like not already indexed, so it's like it's not just a key value grid, it's like you have to run the entire query. But like, I guess I'm confused, because it's like if you're running a datomic query or something, it doesn't seem like it's too slow. It seems like you could run that every time. So like maybe I'm not understanding the part that's perceptibly too slow.
Yeah, so it's true. Like if you only have like one user or maybe 10 users, then you totally could just run it every time. And so to tell you the truth, I don't know exactly where is the cutoff. I haven't experimented with that. And it is totally possible. Like maybe if you're only focused on small applications, maybe you totally could set this up where you just have it run the whole query every time, and now you can subscribe to expressive queries. So that could be worth looking into. I haven't experimented with it myself. I do like definitely at some point, if you get any kind of scale, I'm sure that will break down. I just don't know exactly when. And so with my approach to Biff, I've wanted to make it something that I know I'm not going to have to like completely re-architect at some point in the future, right? So with the current approach, I'm sure if I got any appreciable scale, I'm sure I will have to do lots more work on Biff to make sure it's efficient. But as far as I can tell, I don't think the general approach will have to be thrown out, So does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
Cool. Yeah. So, all right. So let's move on to the next section. So yeah, frameworks are not always as good as libraries, and especially if you're kind of an experienced Clojurist, you might have red flags thinking like, oh, frameworks are not as good as libraries, right? And this little quote that I've made is, basically how I think of it. You know, libraries are kind of forced to be more simple because they are all separated from each other in different packages. So they, you know, they can't really depend on each other as much, right? And so it just naturally makes things that are, you know, the concerns are separated, and so they're much easier to compose and put together and blah, blah, blah. And frameworks are kind of the inverse of that. You know, we put everything together at first, so now you don't have to do that work of putting stuff together. But now the downside is it's exactly like the problem with headphones. You know, before we had AirPods, you take like a nice, clean, untangled set of earphones and you put them in your pocket, and what happens? They turn into this big ball of spaghetti, and like nothing happened. It just happens automatically. And code is exactly the same. It's just like it just tangles on its own, and like I don't even know how, right? And so that's why my answer to the way I think about this question is it's not that frameworks are inherently bad. It's just they're extremely hard to get right. And so in practice, in a lot of cases, it's, you know, in the long run, it's probably better if you just do libraries. You know, if you are just doing a weekend project and you know you're not going to like try to continue to grow the project, maybe it doesn't matter and you just use a framework because it's easy. But if you want it to grow, then it really needs to be simple, right? And so this is kind of one of the questions that I have been thinking about for a long time and that I am trying to solve. I wouldn't say I have the answer yet, but what makes a framework simple? And in general, I think the answer is decomposability. It's like when you're making a framework, you need to think about not just how do you take the parts and put them all together, but how do you take them apart? Because that's, you know, that's where things go wrong. And at like level one, at a minimum, you need to have some kind of explicit plan for that. Like, how's it going to work? If you don't even think about it, you're definitely not doing it right. Like if you're thinking, oh, we're going to make a framework that is going to handle everyone's problems and they'll never need to take it apart, then it's just definitely not going to be good, right? So you need to at least be thinking about the problem. And so I've got a few code samples from BIF, and so we're going to go through these so that you can get an idea of, you know, what is the structure of the code and how would you take it apart. And so hopefully we've at least passed level one, but we'll see how well it does. So here is example.core. So this is the entry point namespace for an application, like the demo application. And so when your app starts, this main function will be called. And it will call this bif.core/start system function. And this is where all the magic of BIF happens on the back end. And so when you call this function, there are two things that you need to pass to it. So one is this map, a configuration map. And this includes the rest of the code from your application. So for example, these are HTTP routes that you've defined, and these are authorization rules like we were talking about before. So you put all these and pass it to start system, and then the other thing that you pass in is a collection of components. And I'll explain what components are in a second. But here we have bif.core default SPA components. So BIF provides a collection of components, and this is where all the work happens. So like setting up the Crux database, setting up web sockets, and setting up the transaction listener and notifying clients about their subscriptions. All of those things are defined in these component functions. So when you pass these things into the start system function, what it does, so here's start system. It will take the configuration object map and it will just pass it through each of the functions. It's pretty simple. So each component is a function, so we pass components in, we pass the config in, and each component will take that map. I also call it a system map. So a system map, and it will return a modified version of that system map. And once all of the components have run, then we take the result and we stick it in this atom right here. And that's our system. So an example of what a component function looks like is, right, so here's the component function for starting the web server. So we take the system map and we pull a few configuration values out of it. So like the handler function and host import, and we pass them to Jetty. So Jetty's our web server. And then, so we've started this resource, and then we return the system map again, but we modify it. There's a special key biff/stop, and this is where we put, anytime we start a resource, we include a function that will close that resource. So here's, a function that will close the Jetty server that we just started. And so going back here, so, that'll go in system and blah, blah, blah. And so the answer of Biff, so Biff's decomposability story, it's basically the same like Ring middleware. So if you're familiar with middleware, it's kind of like you have a request map that represents your HTTP request, and you pass it to a middleware function, and it it takes it, maybe modifies it, passes on to the next one. And so Biff component functions are the same thing. It's just functional composition. And so the way that Biff is taken apart is through functional decomposition. Instead of passing in this default list of components, you can mix and match the functions however you want. You can take some out. And so, for example, that is how the multi-page application template works. I took this list and I just took some of them out, like the ones for subscription handling and WebSockets. You don't need that if it's server-side rendering. So I took some components out and changed some other ones. And you can do that however you need. You can define your own components. You can copy an existing component and then chain into your own code and then change the body of it if you needed to do something. And yeah, so that's how you can do it. The components some of them do take configuration options also. So you, like for simple things, like we saw before, the web server takes like a port and host and things. So you can also just like pass in configuration options. But I have not attempted to make tons and tons of configuration options because that would complicate things. And if you need to do something kind of deep, you can always just modify the components. And so there should never be a situation where you have to fork Biff to get it to do what you want, right? So that is Biff's strategy. However, that alone will not necessarily imply that Biff is definitely simple and untangled, because the components are still put together by Biff, right? And so they still communicate with each other by passing values through the system map. And so there is not really any way to guarantee that they aren't tangled with each other, that they aren't like expecting certain things. And so I think in practice, the only way to really make sure it's simple is constant vigilance, basically. So if you need to have multiple projects that actually use the thing and actually take it apart. I mean, it's the same general concept comes up in a lot of places, kind of like with multiple web browsers. In my opinion, it's extremely important for the open web that we have multiple web browsers and not just Google Chrome. Because, we have this standard for, HTML and CSS and things. And the only way to keep that standard actually, pure is if you have multiple web browsers that implement it and they're forced to, play nicely together, right? If you only have one, then the standard is kind of bound to just be sort of consumed. And I think and that's pretty much the same way I think about like Biff and this whole decomposability thing, is that the best way to ensure that it actually is simple and it's taken apart is if so we encourage decomposability, but then if people also use it and, they make projects, and since Biff encourages decomposability, people will be more likely to actually do that. So when they hit some problem, they'll be able to change BIF to be however they need it to be. And then if there are parts, and I'm sure there are parts that are currently tangled together in BIF, those will surface naturally, and I will find out about it on the issues page, I'm sure. But then those components can be refactored to be more simple. So anyway, again, I don't know if I have all the answers on that, but that is my thinking so far. And I'm kind of crossing my fingers that, hopefully this is at least an incremental improvement over what we have. And that is everything. So I hope for anyone who is still getting up to speed with Clojure, I hope BIF could maybe help you be able to make your dreams come true, make your ideas become a reality. Thanks, everyone. All right, okay. All right, so what criticisms do you all have?
Only joking ones.
Joking is good too.
No, I mean, as in they would just be like, nah, I don't really, because I mean, like I want to give it a try. Like I've definitely been searching around for something I can get started up with quickly, and like trying to roll my own set of things seems a little bit like I definitely know what pieces I would want to use, and they look a lot similar to what you've done. And then similarly, like, I mean, even yesterday I was like, okay, well, I need to upgrade to Datomic Pro in order to like make web development easy. And then I'm like, I'm not going to be making $200 a month in the next like 2 years. So like, I can't do that. That's just dumb. So it was kind of like a, I've been really excited about, this way of doing things. And now I feel like I can't justify it in reality, like when the tires hit the road. So like, you using Crux and is interesting, but at the same time, like part of me, maybe irrationally is like, well, at some point, if I want to go to Datomic, like how realistic is it ever to swap out a database? Like, I don't think I've ever seen a company swap out a database. Like, really, not like I've seen them add them, but like not like, oh yeah, we'll just, over the weekend, we'll transition our database. Like,
how hard could it be?
Yeah. And so it's like, but if I'm early on and I don't have that many users, and like, it might not matter, but like, so it's I need to do something. And so the idea of having something that is really decomposable is incredibly enticing. So I'm glad that's like as to how well it's going to work, like you said, I'll have to try. But I mean, having like an example where you've done that would be educational. Like if you switch out, like, I don't know, what would be, so it's like sent a component, like the other pieces, having one of them swapped out. I don't know what for though.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, one thing we do kind of have is the two project templates. So we have like the, the single page and the multi-page, and so that might kind of demonstrate it a little bit. It's not so much swapping things out as just taking things out. But yeah.
Yeah. So you're just like deleting the code. Is that what you're saying? That's like, that makes sense.
Yeah. It just leaves out a handful of the components that server-side rendering apps don't need. I have thought a little bit about Datomic, because I do like Crux quite a lot. You should totally check it out. And so I don't really see myself moving away from Crux myself, but there was someone who, I'm trying to think of what his name was. I forgot, but he was interested in adding Datomic support to BIF. I don't know how far he got on it, but we did, like theoretically, like I think it should be possible. Like I think it would still be a little bit hairy. But I did set things up. Like the main thing is the query, like, the subscribable queries. You'll have to set things up differently in order to like watch the transaction log. But I did restructure the code a little bit. So a lot of it has been pulled out into a protocol. And so there's a protocol for getting certain things from the database, like getting a batch of transaction log updates. And currently I only have one implementation of that protocol. It's a Crux client, but it's set up in a way so that you theoretically could make a datomic client that you should be able to just kind of plug in. It's, I think it still would be like quite a bit of work, and there's a lot of just like little loose ends you would have to tie up everywhere. Theoretically, though, I don't know, it's kind of an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah. And then one other, so even if you're just doing like tree pull semantics, and that's something you allow, what do you do if there's like multiple on a page? How does the system, how is it resolving? Like if I'm thinking now in, like the HTML tree, and then we like to model it by having like tree pulls inside of the tree to various things potentially. And so now there's like maybe 6 requests. Is there any sort of mechanism for that, or are they all, what's the story there? Or does the question make sense? Or
do you mean like if you have like 6 different tree pull queries from different parts of the application, but it is the question like if some of them are overlapping, like fetching the same data?
So to be concrete, let's say I've got like like a users, and maybe also there's like a books like table, and on the page I display users and books, so there's 2 requests to 2 different tables that need to happen in order for this to be, there's not a join between them like above that I'm pulling. I'm doing them separately, so like they both need to be resolved.
Yeah,
I mean, I guess, is that possible? Is that not?
Yeah, totally. So the way that BIF handles querying for data and subscribing to data is the front-end interface is made up of 2 atoms. And so there's an atom for your subscriptions and then an atom for the subscription results. So so the atom for the subscriptions, it just takes a set of values, and each value represents a query that you want to subscribe to. So in that case, the atom, you would just have it contain 2 separate queries, one for books and one for users, and no problem.
Okay, that makes sense. I guess because it's not having to, like, those calls are in the background. They're not like interrupting each other in some form. Yeah, that makes sense. Does anyone else have questions? I'll hog all the time otherwise. Do you have any like thoughts on, because like the other hard part of web development that nobody wants to talk about, the dirty secret, is just how hard like styling is and getting things that are visually interesting. I'm curious, like in your plans, is there anything that, I mean, because there's like CSS grid, which goes some way to making things composable and decomposable, maybe too is an interesting way of thinking about it. But like, I'm just curious, like in your vision, is that, like, I don't know how that would be tied in with like the idea of, syncing things, which is definitely a huge pain point, but maybe just like I guess my like pie in the sky idea is that, if we treated the HTML more just like data too, that would help, because we're sort of suffering from this fact that like we're treating it different. It's like, I don't know, you can't query for it to see, like, it would be really nice if I was transacting my HTML and like updating things through the same semantics that I update all my other data. And I think the path forward for that is like possible. It's just no one else seems to, I mean, there's a couple things where they try to treat it the same way, but like it's not universal yet. So I'm worried there's lots of pain points there that I'm not considering. Did that form a question? That's
I think the first part of the question, like of just style, well, I'll tell you what the stuff I have thought about styling so far, which is extremely little. And I'm not really familiar with the second part of what you're talking about. It sounds very interesting. And so I'd love to hear more about it. But so far, like the BIF template, it uses Tailwind CSS, which I started using that about, let's see, it was about, I think 6 weeks ago or something. I used Bootstrap for a while. Tailwind, I really like, actually. I think they have a very good model for, doing things. And so I've, like for my own applications, I've been able to use that and just do stuff, like do the classes and things by hands, and it's worked out fine for me. My apps don't look like super professional or anything, but they at least look good enough that I don't get tons of feedback saying like your landing page sucks or things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, your landing page looks fine.
Thanks.
I guess like an alternative way of like state management that I'm curious if it'll get any momentum are sort of rules engine based, like things like Precept or recently Zach Oates did Odoyo rules, which I think is really like essentially the way that I'm thinking about it is it's not better than the current way of doing things, but it's like it's an inversion that like makes kind of the flow of actions a lot more transparent in your code. And since like you can pull the visual element out from that easier, like the reverse is a lot harder. You can't like take the tree oriented visual first structure that a lot of people use where then like they nest async events inside of the tree. You can't like then extract the async events and like list them. Like how will it look if I just was ordering the actions? But I feel like you could do the reverse because it's just they're more components, and it's like data or in Odoro rules, like because you're using data as the events, then you should be able to like theoretically like pull them all out and like construct the tree at the end. I mean, and on top of that, you have the actual DOM you can look at in the browser. So you don't have to like guess at what the HTML will look like. You can just look at your browser and it's like, oh yeah, that's right. I'm just curious if you've like messed with that or had any thoughts concerning like that as a potential. I guess you didn't really get into, or I don't understand within the subscription model that you talked about, if that precludes or like excludes that possibility, or how it would relate.
Yeah. So I am extremely interested in O'Doyle rules, which you just brought up, and so I haven't like looked into it or tried to use it myself yet. It's on my list of things to do, but from what I understand about it, I think it's totally would be a great way to go. And so I am planning to try to put that with BIF, and the way it would fit is, so like I mentioned, so BIF on the front end has the two atoms, right? And so what I want to try to do with the O'Doyle rules is make it so you take the atom that's the result of your subscriptions, right? So it's basically your current state on the front end. But then you plug that into the O'Doyle rules. And so you use O'Doyle rules to generate the subscriptions. And so I'm kind of like, currently I'm accomplishing that with just runs derived atoms, which are kind of like reactions in reagent. So like, when one atom changes, you have other atoms that use that value and then also change, right? And so I use that in BIF right now, in the template app at least, to generate this list of subscriptions based on your current state. But it is kind of inefficient. Like at my current scale, like it works just fine. But if you were to, like, as your front end grows and gets larger, it'll most likely slow down. I mean, it will definitely slow down at some point, right? And so I think O'Doyle rules would make it efficient. Like it'd be a way that you could, set up thing and all your derivations and things, but they could be computed efficiently without having to like if you have some atom that's like filtering over the values of some other atom, and then like one of the volumes in the first item changes, you don't have to like do the entire filter over. You can just recompute the little bit that actually changed. So I don't know if that makes sense, but that's what
I think you understand it a bit better than I do, which is encouraging. No, that's good, because I mean, like, I'm just looking at it for, I mean, like, I understand there's rule engine optimizations dealing with, like, you know, not so that you're re-updating at the minimal amount, but I'm also just excited about like the mental model it presents, because I think it's like that action first. I mean, we're all like, functional programming is about like, you know, making things like driven by the actions, and then we get to like front end development, and it's like, oh, here's a big object you put your state in and have things update with inside of it, and it's like, okay, but where's like my pipeline? There's no pipeline. So it would be nice to just like have it to see if it was better. Cool. That's really informative. Because I kind of want to get going with BIF, and that's like my first. If I, you know, the other thing that I'm excited about was Zodora rules, and it's like, if I could try to do them at the same time. I mean, like, if I might try to bring it in and see what that would look like. So hopefully I can do something there and maybe get help out in some way. We'll see.
And send me a pull request, because I really want to use that myself too.
Yeah. I'll see, because I talked to Zach, and I was like, how would you hook this up to Datomic? And he's like, well, really, there's nothing that precludes like that, you know, you writing like hooks and like, you know, just using the session, and because there was nothing like inherent about it in his mind that restricted it to, you know, updating a Datomic client. So I don't, you know, what you said syncs with that. So I don't think there's, you know, I'll give it a try. It's like, I can't formulate it without going in there and trying to do it. So
yeah, I mean, again, I don't understand very much about it myself either, but yeah, from what I can tell, I think it should be pretty independent of where the data comes from in the first place.
Yeah, I guess the mystery for me is in terms of the optimizations, I always assumed rules engines had to be able to communicate over the entire like data set as they like figured out, you know, what needed to be done. So it's like, I just have to think about, like, I'm gonna have to go back and review how they work, probably, you know, to the same level that Zach Oates maybe has done to get a sense of how that would integrate. So that might be a hot minute.
Yeah.
Oh, my wife turned the light off.
Okay. Cool. Well, anyone else got any questions or comments or anything else you want to talk about? Or jokes?
Somebody else has got to say something. I'm calling a new name here. Oh, I thought it.
I just wanted to mention that was really good. I didn't realize that was the whole scope of BIF. I've seen several of the sites that you made that are kind of related. Now, don't you have a project? I guess I thought it was BIF, but a project that is about that learns preferences. Which one? What's that?
Yes, that is what I'm building with BIF. So that is my startup, Findco.com,
Okay.
And it has evolved quite a lot. The current iteration of it is I'm doing just articles/essays. And so you get an email, and you can, you know, specify how often you want to get it, like every day or every week or whatever. And it's basically like a newsletter. Like, you get an email with a list of links, you click on the links and read the articles. The difference is that instead of, you know, some human curating what are the articles that you get, it's machine learning. So all the links are proxied through a server, which is running BIF, of course. And so when you click the link, it'll record, oh, you clicked on this link. And then there are also other links, like for I liked this article, or I didn't like this article, it's clickbait or something. And so from you just using the newsletter, naturally it will learn your preferences, and then figure out what articles it should send you in the future. So it's still, this iteration of Findco I launched about 6 or 7 weeks ago. And we've been doing 20 to 30 daily active users since it launched on Hacker News a little bit ago, which is far better than any of my previous startup ideas have done. So I'm happy about that. But we're still not growing every week. We're still flat. But at least we got something to work with.
Yeah, that's an exciting project.
Thanks.
Are you just pulling articles from the entire, like, out of curiosity, is there like a set data set of articles? Or are you pulling from the entire internet?
I'm
Do not want to
pulling
reveal
from.
your.
No, I'm fine. So that part, I'm 100% pulling from user submissions. So it's kind of like Hacker News, and on the landing page, I compare it with Hacker News and things. So yeah, so I mean that there are some companies who have done this thing, and that is kind of their focus. That it's like more of the big data approach, like, oh, we're going to ingest like 1 billion articles and do this like content based, machine learning stuff and figure out which articles we should show you. And Findka is a far different approach to that. I'm totally just relying on articles that users submit, partially in the hope that user curation is, well, I'm hoping that having user curated articles will increase the average quality of the article. And so what I'm focusing on is purely just filtering over them. And so at the moment, we only have like 230 articles in the database. And we get about 50 to 100 clicks per day. But yeah, so compared to other recommender system things, it's actually a pretty small amount of data. And so it's an interesting problem of thinking about, okay, given this tiny amount of data we have, how good can we get it?
Yeah. Have you thought about like multiple different types of communities? Like, I mean, the same idea with like rebranding, and then you like have 8 of them, because I feel like, especially in the startup world, if you're if you're being reasonable, you try to cast a lot, you try to throw a lot of darts, and you don't know what's going to land. So you like might, you know, revamp it so that it's like curating for cooking articles, and then you release it somewhere into the wild, like with a, a slightly friendlier UI, and then the same concept, because it's kind of, all of a sudden just for some reason gets lucky and like 100 people are using it because like, some famous blogger was like, I really like this, and now it's boom and it's huge. And so there's no controlling that on your end, but because conceptually the idea transfers, right? So like, well, I mean, maybe articles, people want to, certain categories of people probably want to read articles more than others, but there's a lot of people out there that would, I guess, in different spaces.
Yeah. Yeah, that is a really good idea. I actually have kind of thought about that. It's basically it's on my list, and I might, if I have a list of like just general algorithm improvements and other things I want to implement right now, but I could see myself, if like say like maybe a month from now, if I get through those things and I'm still trying to figure out, okay, how can I get it to grow more, I would definitely be interested in trying something like that. Because like long term, the algorithm should handle that automatically. Because the whole point of it is like, whatever you're interested in, Findco will figure out your specific preferences and just send you what you're interested in, right? But it's kind of like, it's like given a sufficiently trained algorithm, it's kind of like given a sufficiently intelligent compiler. In reality, we don't quite have that, and Findco certainly is not anywhere near to that. So I think doing something like that could work really well. And I actually think of it a lot like Reddit. Like people can just make different subreddits. I was thinking about like maybe I should make it so you can have like sub communities in Findco. So like anyone could like make a community, and then when you submit articles, you can like choose which community they go to, but then use that as a way to like bootstrap the algorithm. So like, okay, even if the algorithm isn't super smart yet, we can use these communities. So at least hopefully the average article is not horrible. And then over time, we can, you know, maybe mix them together a little bit when the algorithm is smart enough to do that. But,
yeah, I mean, I mean, in part, what you're solving is a psychological human issue. Like people want to be in like communities, like, and so they're, if you tell them they're like part of everyone's community, they feel like they're part of no community.
yeah.
So like, you know, I mean, initially I think, you know, if you like, you're going to get developers and they're going to be like, oh, this is developer stuff, it's going to be really good for them. But then like, imagine you're like something that's not a developer and you join, the first article you're going to get is going to be a developer one, and you're going to be like, nope, like it's just never going to but
yeah,
I mean, because it's a good idea. It's just, you know, like I don't know where I'm going with that. It's just that, you know, I'm kind of thinking about these things myself, so I'm curious how you're.
Yeah,
you know.
yeah, I totally agree. And so yeah, I could definitely, I think unless I, you know, start getting rocket ship growth pretty soon without doing that, I most likely will explore doing that.
Yeah, I think because I feel like I was talking to another Clojure, and this is what's, you know, one of the exciting things about Clojure and your whole decomposability is that like it, you know, you don't feel that you can do this more often. Because I remember talking to another dev and he's like, oh yeah, I've got like 30 dating websites, you know, and I was like, well, I was just thinking about that. I'm like, oh yeah, because like you want dating for X, dating for Y, dating for Z, and then you go there and you feel like this is a community for me, right? Like, so I felt like that was a really clever. I mean, he probably got in much earlier on this, like maybe this was 20 years ago or something. But that would have been like a, you know, obviously, even today is like a probably a halfway decent idea. Anyway, just saying, like I know offhand of like at least one developer who I felt like was saying that's how they probably are managing it, is through the kind of like, you know,
Yeah,
especially because if you're a big company, like I don't think that's an easy pivot, as easy to make. Like you have to be really big and then you can do that, you know, as we're like, if you're smaller but you have, you know, a lot of composability, you can kind of tweak things so that that's much more likely to happen.
yeah, totally. It kind of reminds me of, I've been thinking a lot lately about like what is the ideal social networking setup, and an idea I'd like to try at some point with FindKatsu is make it so like in addition to the articles you submit, you could also submit links to other online communities. So for example, if you're part of like a Slack workspace or a Discord server or something, or even just like a Facebook group or something, you could put a link to that in there. But then now also as you're receiving articles, you could also get recommendations for communities so that you can find out, oh, you know, people who are interested in these same things as you are also in these online communities that you can join and actually go talk to people. And so it would be like separating the discovery portion from the like humans talking to each other, which is like the hard toxic part of social networking, right? And so we could just like offload that and let other people handle it.
Yeah, and the like, given what you're into, this is also what you should be to diversify your thoughts on things. Here's some communities you disagree with.
Yeah,
you know, enjoy. Like, I don't know what that would look like, but that would be pretty. That would be pretty rad.
yeah.
I think the greatest invention in the future will be like the Google glasses that filter out things you don't want to see. You know, they're not going to do that, but like that would be the nice thing. You just put them on and ads on the screen just like blur, so you don't have to see them.
That'd be sweet. Yeah, with the like showing your articles that like disagree with. One of the things I was also thinking of having like a sub community of FindCode that was specifically for politics. But then also have a way so you can rate articles more specifically. So you could say like, I agree with this article or I disagree with this article, but you could also say like, what do I think about the quality of this article? So like maybe I disagree with this article, but I thought it was an intellectually honest, well-supported argument. right? As opposed to it was just like horrible. You know, even maybe this is an article I agree with, but their argument is horrible or something. And so if you had those kinds of ratings, you totally could do something like you just said. Like you could say, okay, here are articles that you like, but here are some articles that you are probably going to disagree with, but people like you have rated them as being well backed up and things.
Yeah, that would be useful. Cool.
Well, it's been, let's see, an hour 15 minutes. Sorry that Dan wasn't able to come and give you a far better presentation than me. But maybe we'll see him next time. And if no one else has anything else they want to talk about, maybe we will end here tonight. So, all right. See, it sounds good to you, Tori? If Tori's still
All right. Thanks everyone for being here. And thank you, Jacob, for that. Appreciate it. Everyone have a good night.
Thanks, Jacob. Thanks, Tori. Thanks for hosting this.
And see y'all next month.
Thank you.
See y'all.
All right. Bye-bye.